Hello and welcome. The pandemic, Covid-19, has been now with us for more than a year in India and the rest of the world. We've just seen or are just seeing the beginning of the tapering off of the second wave. We do not know at this point whether the second wave in itself is going to continue or whether the second wave will give way to a third wave. It's also equally clear that we don't seem to have learned the lessons from the first wave quite well, as maybe some other countries did a little better and therefore were better prepared for what happened after. And what India has faced, particularly in the months of April, May 2021, will go down in history for more reasons than one. So this is a good time to ask whether we learn lessons in general, and B, whether we learn lessons that have been with us for a long time and maybe even going back over a century. So to answer that question, so I can pose them to is Dr. Chinmay Tumbe of the Department of Economics at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. Chinmay is a master's from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a PhD from IIM Bangalore. And he's written a book called The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, where he looks at three pandemics and how they shaped India and the world. So, Chinmay, thank you very much for joining us today. So, let me ask you the straight question first. Have we learned the right lessons or any lessons from the first set of pandemics that we've seen going back decades, if not centuries?
Well, I mean, there are ways to look at this question. The quick answers, because of the massive crisis that we've all, collectively just gone through, would obviously be no, given the sense that, we had the first wave. We know from history that pandemics do come in waves. We should have been much more prepared, so we did definitely take the eye off the ball in that case. So in that case, definitely not learning from history. I think the larger problem is that until WHO announced this as a pandemic in March 2020, I think most Indians had never really heard of a pandemic. Even the SARS and the stuff that happened in the last 20 years, this happened somewhere else. It didn't affect India. And that's why I wrote this book, because India was completely knocked out, for nearly a century, and especially those last 50 years, from 1870 to 1920, where the life expectancy rates and death rates, which are already high, started actually, the life expectancy rate started falling and death rates started increasing. And this was a really deadly period in Indian history, where cholera, plague, and then eventually the 1918 influenza pandemic, really wiped out a lot of Indians. That particular juncture, of course, led to very important improvements in science, technology, and that's why we say in the last 100 years, yes, the big learning over time is that we're no longer dying at 20, we're dying at average life expectancy at 70. But in this one century, precisely because it's taken 100 years for the next big pandemic to arrive, the sense of collective memory has definitely been lost. So let me give you an example of, for example, a classic policy error of last year, where history had a lot of lessons to offer. We had last year a migration crisis, where we saw people walk back home. And history tells us that, there were ways to kind of anticipate what was going to happen when you enforce a national lockdown. For the simple reason why, because the British actually had to face the same trade-offs, similar policy choices back then, especially when the plague arrived. Do we shut down the trains or not? Do we, how harsh should the lockdown be? And all these kind of debates are not new. They are new, of course, in our generation, but they were happening all the time for 30, 40 years in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so one of the learnings I would definitely say, which did not happen from then to now, but which we saw actually happen from last year to this year. So it's not just learning from 100 years back. I think there's been some learning from last year to this year as well. For the fact that we have not seen a migration crisis this year, despite having major lockdowns or restrictions. Yes, migrant workers are suffering, but it's simply not the same as what we saw last year. And that's because we have kept the transport systems alive at a meager level, but they're alive so that people who want to go back do not have to walk back home. So that's a learning which could have happened last year. From 100 years back, it did not, but we've learned from last year this year. And so we have one crisis less, because last year we had two crises. This year, we don't have the migration crisis. So there are various examples, of course, like this on vaccination, a variety of things which I'll be happy to talk about.
Right. So tell us about vaccination. So what is the lesson from the past that informs the present?
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the book, I point out the Hafkin Institute, which is now, by the way, being roped in It's going to start its production apparently in 8 months. But the Hafkin Institute was like the Serum Institute, 100 years back. It was the vaccine producing star of India. And in 1931, the annual report mentions that where there was a riot, if you pressed for vaccination, basically vaccine hesitancy, now there's a riot if the vaccine supplies run out, right? And this kind of tells you how this mindset shift happens. It takes time, but it's very important for mindset shifts to happen. Now, how do you get over vaccine hesitancy, which is such a big issue even 100 years later in a country like India? Is through really, very good concentrated public communication, demonstration effects where panchayat leaders, politicians, filmmakers, whoever, influencers take the vaccination shot and tell others that this is the right thing to do. So, for example, if we want all our villagers to get vaccinated, we need the people, the influencers at the village level to really push it up. The second thing what history tells us is that we have to be very careful with adverse events. Uh, the vaccination drive during the plague was set back by a few years precisely because of a certain accident in which Hafkin was himself implicated. Then he was cleared of his charges. But that's what can happen. If vaccination rollout, because there's such a huge demand, we have to be very careful with the protocols, with the safety procedures, and we have to take it for granted that there will be, unfortunately, some adverse events. Adverse events meaning people, succumb precisely because they have taken the vaccine or some sort of procedural lapse which has taken place. Now, how do you deal with the fallout of those adverse events is very important, because if you have adverse events, they can very quickly become public relations disasters. In which case, you're getting more vaccine hesitancy at a time when you want more people to take vaccines. Now, that's something which we've not seen yet. But again, because this is a session where we're talking about what history offers, I think this is clearly something that we should learn from history. That is, have a good strategy on how to deal with adverse events in case something goes wrong on this vaccine rollout. The third is, of course,
Right.
that is, yeah, sure.
No, go ahead.
The third is, of course, vaccine manufacturers, right? That is, we need to get vaccines from as many manufacturers as possible, safe vaccines, and we need to spread our bets widely. That is, you can't just pick one or two manufacturers given the demand supply constraint, and so you need to go all out. And just to give an example, again, during the plague pandemic, we actually invited the best scientists, we meaning the British state at that time, invited the best scientists of the world to come. They came to Bombay and they all tested. So you have, Hafkin's Vafkin, but Yersin, after whom the plague, bacteria is now named, he also came and, tried out different things. So we have to be open to the best science and technology that the world has to offer in order to get over it.
Right. Okay. So, and the point that you made is interesting. You're saying that focus on communication, because you're likely to see adverse effects. And if you don't manage those adverse effects, you will only see vaccine hesitancy rising, which in itself becomes a bigger challenge than what you started with.
Absolutely. And the issue out here is adverse events will set back by huge margin. This is, of course, we have the example of the sterilization campaigns, under Indira Gandhi's reign in the 1970s. That set back the family planning calendar, which otherwise was perfectly sensible, right? It's set back by decades. Now, of course, we are not on that time scale in this pandemic. But what I'm just saying is that, it can set back in a huge way. And we know from all the available information that a hugely critical part of getting over the pandemic is the vaccination, right? And so if the population is not going to get vaccinated, it's quite likely that if we do have potentially future waves, we're going to go through these similar cycles again and again. So we need to get into this vaccination mode as quickly as possible, and that's why dealing with adverse effects, which so far, touch wood,
Right.
nothing's happened, is a very important part, which could happen, and that's again something that history tells us.
Right. In any case, many or most vaccines are in the 80 to 90% efficacy. So it's logical that some will not benefit fully or may actually see the infection breaking through.
Yeah. The thing, how did vaccine hesitancy reduce during the plague pandemic? It's a very interesting thing. One is people started seeing the benefits, and one is you can see the benefits where at your village level, certain people who got the vaccine suddenly seem to be surviving this disease very high. Remember, plague was a terrible disease. It was not very virulent, but the case mortality ratios were something like 80%, which means if you got it, you're pretty much a goner, right? So, of course, in that case, the vaccine effectiveness rates, by the way, were much lower than what the vaccine that we have now, right? But they started getting a currency back then. And that's what we need to do now, is to show people, demonstrate saying that, look, the thing with the coronavirus is the case mortality rates are very low, right? So people have this idea that, even if we don't take it, we'll take a chance. Right? So we have to convey to people then say, no, the chances of surviving are much, much greater, right? If you get the vaccine, if vis-a-vis you don't.
Right.
And show examples of people not taking vaccines and unfortunately succumbing, and when they could have taken the vaccine, things could have been different.
Right. So let's talk about the public policy response to this. Now, in your book, you also talk about politicians and how many politicians cut their teeth during pandemics, including in India. So walk us through that. And secondly, and somewhat obviously, what is the link between the way politicians and those in office or high office responded then, and what are the lessons that we could extrapolate, if so, for today?
Yeah, I think while researching this book, it really struck me that all these great freedom fighters of ours that we learn in our school textbooks and so on, we never really understand how much of their lives were revolving around pandemic management. It's again this blank spot in Indian history where the pandemics have vanished. So think of Sardar Patel. I'm based in Ahmedabad right now. Sardar Patel pretty much starts his public life, as a member of the sanitation committee in the Ahmedabad municipality, and then plague really hits Ahmedabad big time in 1917. Sardar Patel is on the streets trying to help people and so on. And he's multiple plague outbreaks after that as well, where he's very much in the thick of the action. You have people like Gokhale, people like Tilak in Western India, who become absolute stars because of the way they're kind of countering the British on the one hand, but also kind of dealing with pandemic. And I also mentioned the book cooperatives. The whole cooperative movement in India requires a lot of solidarity that came about in organizing relief for plague and all these other epidemics at that time. So interestingly, what pandemics do, of course, is bring out a lot of people on the ground to do relief work, which creates new networks, creates potentially new political leaders who will then 30 years down the line say that we cut our teeth in the great corona pandemic of 2021. So just to give you a pointer, hypothetically, if Sonu Sood becomes the Prime Minister of India 30 years down the line, it would be because of the pandemic. It's quite likely that without the pandemic, this is just a hypothetical scenario. But
Sure.
I'm saying that when a lot of these leaders like like Patel and so on, when they got into it, they were not they didn't even know that India will become an independent
Right.
country, but will become a home minister and so on, right? But that's how it happened. So the point being, pandemic relief and coordination activities generates a new class of kind of people who would not have otherwise taken this particular line of career and push them systematically towards it. So that's one aspect of this. The second aspect is there any learning from this? Of course, I would say limited in the sense that that was the British state. The British state clearly favored protecting Britain from diseases much more than India from diseases. But I think the takeaway is the systematic attention paid to science and technology, right? The fact that cholera was a massive epidemic for both Britain and India in the early 19th century, but by the end of the 19th century, Britain had kind of completely cut out cholera, and India was still ravaged by cholera. Right? And of course, these are British medical officers in India. What Britain had done was actually move on to this waterborne theory. They had kind of taken on to the cutting edge science of what people learned about the epidemics, whereas the same British medical officers in India who were steeped in a completely different paradigm, they basically said stuff like cholera is not waterborne and so on. So I think the key takeaway is, of course, that you have to pay attention to science and technology. Take the example of Brazil, which I give in the book. 100 years back, Brazil did a reasonably good job against the plague pandemic. They got one of the best Brazilian scientists in the world, who was at that time in France, a young guy. They got him to Brazil and said, deal with this. And many of them credit the roots of their public health system to those institutions that fellow set up. And of course, you cut to today, and Brazil's response has been very shoddy. And one of the reasons people would say is that because it's not paid sufficient attention to science and technology. I think that's really critical. And I must say, if you look at our response last year, there was a migration crisis, but I do think the government had the right intentions in the sense that they did take it very seriously. They did take the idea that the pandemic could devastate lives, and they placed a huge premium on lives over livelihoods. Unfortunately, that sort of approach was not there this year, and that was the kind of unfortunate. If you ask me to compare between wave one and wave two, I think that we kind of stepped in very late into the wave. Even I remember by April 20th or April 17th, things had not changed fundamentally in terms of acknowledging the crisis when cases had already kind of surpassed the earlier waves totals and so on. So I think that's the learning. That is, you know, uh, I end this book with two words: patience and humility. And I believe these are the core kind of personality traits you need to manage a pandemic. The patience that pandemics rarely get over in a few months, which means this is a long drawn out game, and humility that that you have to learn as you go, and you should not actually celebrate the end of a pandemic. The British, unfortunately, sometimes back then also declared the end of plague in 1897. Plague haunted India for 20 more years, and it's only when transmission was completely understood and a lot of other things happened that slowly the plague started receding. So patience and humility, I think these are important attributes to have.
Right, and the vaccine is the one thing maybe that's clearly different from before, and of course there is more science around, but human nature is similar or maybe the same. Now, given the fact that pandemics actually last long, how do we calibrate our own expectations, and are there lessons from the way maybe leadership or political leadership defined this or directed this?
It's interesting. I think we don't yet know if COVID is a seasonal disease, but it's interesting that some of the responses, at least to cholera and plague, once they discover that it's seasonal, that is, it hits Indians only in a few months of the year, it's very interesting how society coped up with it. It kind of they understood that certain times of the year, we are unfortunately going to be hit by this, and it kind of they developed a resilience mechanism saying that in these times we will do A, B, C, D. In that time, a huge strategy was evacuation. They would literally evacuate villages and towns and camp outside, kind of let the plague season pass by, right? And in the remaining part of the year, then sort of go full steam, saying, okay, this is now the time to work and get the economy in order. That's an interesting kind of thing that happened back then. Now, unfortunately, right now we don't know which month this is going to happen, whether there's a seasonality effect. All of that thing still demands more research. I just think the way forward is to kind of acknowledge that this pandemic is actually not going to get over until it really gets over across the world, which means new strains can continuously be developing, and that's why the patience, the patience that there will be future waves, and then when you get these in between slots, for example, if we are observing now that cases are falling and so on, then we should actually ramp up, because this ultimately it's a big
Right.
trade-off between lives and livelihoods. This is pretty much now the time to get back that lost output, get back the incomes, maybe inject. A lesson could be that you need a fiscal policy to inject money right now, so that when there is this breathing space, you can actually get the economy back in order. It's quite likely that it will have a future wave, again go down under restrictions, again the economy will. So this is now a new kind of a business cycle which will follow the pandemic cycle, right? And so that's why how I think the key is to kind of ride it smartly.
Right. So two quick and last questions, not related. One is, did you notice in your research that there were frequent lockdowns, or was it long lockdowns and then opening up and so on? And secondly, if you were to think of one political leader in the Indian context who you think combined some of the best attributes of response to pandemic, which includes science and decisiveness and maybe objective approach, who would that be?
From history or now?
History.
From history. I mean, I think Sardar Patel's views. I would say these three names. Sardar Patel, Tilak, and Gokhale. Tilak was, of course, in the protest mode, right? So he was pointing out to all the bad things that the British were doing in extreme surveillance. Remember, I mean, the thing connecting those times and today is a piece of law called the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, and a lot of these guys were, I mean, they dealt with the same law back then. So I would say these three are clearly the biggest stars who are directly linked. Of course, Gandhi was also involved in relief work and variety of things. But these three come to mind because they had responsibility. For example, Gokhale was heading Pune's urban setup, right, for many years after the plague started. So Gokhale, of course, comes across as a very, very a decent administrator. So between these three, I would probably pick Gokhale in terms of how he dealt with the situation, in terms of observing what is happening on the ground, more relief, getting cooperatives to help, and so on. So much more consensus building kind of a person, maybe
Right.
relative to the others. Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
So the first one is about, so were countries locking down, unlocking, or was it long lockdowns? What was, I'm just trying to understand, what was the kind of response that we had then?
Yeah, there was never a national lockdown. They were localized containment measures. The only time it got really serious was during the plague when it first came, and they had quarantine systems across all the railway systems and so on. But there was never something like what we saw last year, for example, as a national lockdown and so on. Of course, a national lockdown also has a particular logic to it. It's not that everything is bad about it. It can potentially stop the spread of disease and so on. But back then, I mean, the word was not lockdown. Typically,
Right.
quarantine was the operative word, and they did try. For example, during the flu of 1918, they shut down places of large gatherings and so on. So certain protocols, definitely were in place. But just like as I write in my book, there's a constant tiff between public health officials who feel they can get into control if nobody's moving around, vis-a-vis business association lobbies who say, look, you can't stop our work because we are making losses. And so this is an eternal fight between the public health officials and the business officials. So what's heartening to see in this wave is that some of, like, I think Uday Kotak rose and said, look, we should be scaling down a bit because we need to get over this pandemic wave. And that's the kind of cooperation that needs to happen. It can't be at loggerheads, one group which is always saying lockdowns never work, let's just be as it is and go ahead, and public health officials saying we have to completely lock down everything right now. So in that sense, the fashionable word now is graded lockdowns and so on, might make sense.
Right.
I'll just say that back then also there was a lot of opposition to restrictions, right? Because it clearly affects livelihoods in such a direct way. So some learnings, I think, in a few months we will kind of get a sense of which were the kinds of protocols which seem to have worked and which may not have. For example, because we have because each state went its own, chose its own policy kind of how to reduce activities. I think hopefully there should be some sort of a best practice which should come about, right? So, for example, a simple thing like shutting down, or opening times of offices. Huge debate on whether you should have it over 1 hour or just have it open for the whole day, but have it for one day of the week. So different kind of mechanism, which we should have actually paid closer attention to in the last wave. But I think after this wave, hopefully officials are talking to each other and saying, okay, what seems to have worked, and so on. You can actually measure these things. I think the Google mobility trends show it quite nicely. And so a good understanding. I think governments can also invest in some data metrics. We've been focusing a lot on the COVID metrics, which is also highly questionable, the COVID cases and COVID deaths. But I feel because this lockdown restriction stuff is so important, maybe it's a good idea to also invest in creating metrics as to how much, how are people moving about on the ground. Google mobility is one metric, but maybe we need more metrics. Because if this is going to keep happening, then the places which are going to do well are places which can restrict and unwind seamlessly, right? And for that, you need some sort of a metric.
Right. And that's perhaps one area where we've clearly progressed, our ability to use technology, of course, to actually measure things better. If we are not, of course, if we are being honest about those numbers and disseminating them honestly. Professor Dr. Chinmay Tumbe, thank you so much for joining me and hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you so much.